Hi, everybody. This is John Sloss from Cinetic Media, and this is the fifth of Viral, our virtual roundtables. And we are happy to be here today with you. The impetus for these roundtables started several months ago, was concern over isolation during the COVID quarantine. And that continues to be the motivation for them. The idea is to promote a sense of community. And considering what we're talking about today, it's really a conversation within a community. It's not meant to provoke controversy. So our feeling was that it might be useful to assemble a panel of thoughtful people to talk about, well, the title of our panel is Issues Surrounding Personal Accountability, Public Shaming, Cancellation, and Redemption. This is a topic that's been on a lot of people's minds for the last few years and has not often been the subject of public discussions. So my hope is that we have a constructive conversation tonight and maybe provoke further conversation within and without the community about these issues. Our panel tonight, I'm going to introduce them right now. Kim Masters of The Hollywood Reporter and The Business, is that what it's called?
Yes, KCRW.
Okay. I'm sorry. I don't live in Los Angeles. It's KCRW. It's the best radio show. It's on the business of Hollywood, and it's appropriately titled The Business. Where do we find you today, Kim?
In Los Angeles, in my home, where I now stay all the time.
Yeah. Yes, that's what's going on in Los Angeles, right?
Yeah, we're not having a surge. It's not good.
No, I'm sorry to hear that. Wesley Morris of the Paper of Record, the New York Times, critic at large. Wesley, welcome. Thanks for doing this.
Thanks for having me.
Where do we find you?
I'm in Brooklyn, New York. I'm in downtown Brooklyn.
Wesley knows I was a producer on Green Book, and his feelings on Green Book are well known, but we've agreed, like gentlemen, not to discuss that tonight. But hopefully we will over a beer at some point in the future. And our third panelist is my neighbor in the Northland, Jon Ronson. Jon, how are you?
I am very well, thank you, John. Yeah, by coincidence, we live right next to each other.
In beautiful downtown Germantown, New York.
Yeah.
And as luck would have it, Jon is the author of So You've Been Publicly Shamed, a wonderful book that foreshadowed a lot of what we're going through now, since it was published when, in 2015?
2015.
Yeah.
When no one was really talking about this stuff. Well, a few people were. Monica Lewinsky did her TED Talk around the same month that my book came out. And I think between the two of us, we kind of started the conversation. And then obviously it's engulfed the world.
Indeed. Before a little bit of housekeeping, those of you who are watching us live can submit questions, and when I'm done with my inquisition, which won't take that long, we will turn to your questions. If you go look at the bottom of your screen, it says Q&A. I think you would submit them there. So this is a very serious subject, but I'm constrained by the bylaws to begin this conversation with a joke. So here goes. Moisha and Max are walking down the street, and they walk by a church. And Moisha says to Max, "Oh, you know, I just heard that if you are willing to go into that church and listen to a conversation about conversion, they will give you $1,000. Max goes, seriously? Moshe goes, yes, I think that's true. Will you wait here while I go in? He says, sure. So Moshe goes in the church. He's there for an hour. He comes out and Max is like, you were in there for an hour. He goes, yeah, it was a really long conversion speech. And Max says, well, did you get the $1,000? Moshe looks at him and says, is that all you people care about?
Oh, God.
All right. Okay.
That is such a microaggression, or max the aggression. As a Jewish girl on the panel.
I'm Jewish, so I can tell it. It was a joke from Jeff Rose, and I have to credit him. So I think a proper way to start this, and I asked him in advance to do that, is to have Jon Ronson give us a succinct history of public shaming.
Okay. Well, when I was writing my book, at one point I went to the Massachusetts archives because I wanted to find very early examples of public punishments. And yeah, it goes back to the dawn of America. I found a very early court record of a woman called Abigail, I think kind of everyone was called Abigail back then. And she was being punished for committing adultery, and she was appealing the punishment. The punishment was a public whipping, and what she was appealing was not the whipping, but the public nature of it. That was the thing that frightened her the most. And then in Benjamin Rush times, when was that, like the late 18th century? Anyway, I assumed, I think like a lot of people do, that the reason why the stocks and the pillory fell out of favor was because they lost the power to shame. Maybe when the villages became towns, shamed people could just lose themselves in the crowd, and so the stocks became a worthless punishment. But instead of that, I found all of these documents from people like Benjamin Rush who were calling for the end of public punishments for the opposite reason, which was that they were too brutal, that they were mangling the mental health of the people being punished. They were disproportionate. So that's why they fell out of favor, as far as I could tell. And then they fell out of favor for a long time. Obviously, they stayed alive in the form of reality television and tabloid newspapers and sex scandals and so on. But they really had a renaissance around 2012, which was a few years into Twitter. Twitter in its earliest days was a very kind of halcyon world. It was a place where people could be unself-conscious, tell shameful secrets about themselves, and other people would say, oh my God, I'm absolutely the same. And, you know, ask any psychiatrist and they'll say that's the best way of healing. The cure for shame is empathy. But from that emerged something else. Because we created a kind of halcyon world, when we saw people in the other world transgressing, we got really annoyed because we'd created this kind of utopia. They were like being, you know, old style misogynists or whatever. So if a newspaper columnist wrote something homophobic, we could get them with the power that we understood and they didn't, to social media shaming. And it worked. We were ahead of the curve when there would be campaigns and the Daily Mail would lose their advertising. And then what happened, I think, is that we fell in love with our new power too much. And a day when we couldn't right a wrong, the day we couldn't get a transgressor, became a day treading water or picking fingernails. And we were no longer looking for powerful people to hold to account, or corporations who had committed some sort of transgression that had actual victims. We started getting people for misspeaking, and it was private individuals. And I guess the ground zero of public shaming, because it was the first great worldwide public shaming that the whole world got behind, was Justine Sacco, who was the AIDS tweet woman. She was getting on a plane to Cape Town and she tweeted what she thought was a kind of Randy Newman type liberal joke: going to Africa, hope I don't get AIDS, just kidding, I'm white. And then when she slept on the plane, it became the worldwide #1 trending topic. She was oblivious to it all. She was asleep on a plane. When she woke up and turned on her phone, a text popped up from somebody she hadn't spoken to in 25 years saying, "I am so sorry to see what's happening to you right now." She was like, "What?" And then the next text was from her best friend who said, "You need to phone me right now. You are the worldwide #1 trending topic on Twitter." And it had become so exciting that people were even linking to a flight tracker website. So everybody was watching as her plane landed, and a hashtag was trending worldwide. Hashtag "Has Justine landed yet?" And that was like the first mega shaming, and I suppose it was the centerpiece of my book on public shaming. But to finish, it's kind of changing all over again, because out of public shaming is coming this new phenomenon called cancel culture, which has become such a broad term. I think it's become like a kind of meaningless term. But I think it's really interesting how, and I'll finish after this. I think it's really interesting how public figures, agents provocateurs, people with big controversial opinions are now, when they're being criticized, are saying, you know, this is a public shaming, I'm being cancelled. They're equating what happened to Justine Sacco with what happened to them, when I think the two situations are very, very different. One was a private individual making a joke to her 170 Twitter followers, and the other is a big columnist with a huge following. And I think there's a kind of moral flattening beginning to happen. Anyway, there you go. Public shaming in 400 years.
There we go. Brilliantly succinct.
Okay.
I want to start this conversation, but I guess the elephant in the room that I would be remiss if I didn't start it without is the Harpers Letter. This appeared a couple days ago, and it's created sort of an echo chamber of people commenting on the people who signed the letter, people commenting on the fact that people are persecuting them for having signed the letter. And I mean, it's fascinating to see. It's obviously a little concerning in general, but I just would like to get a sense. I guess I'd start with you, Wesley. Do you have a point of view on what's on the letter itself and what's happening as a result of it?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of conflicting feelings about all of it. I didn't know about the letter until someone had texted it to me before the letter was a thing. Maybe like the second it went up, or like the minute after it went up. Someone let me, like, they just forwarded me the letter, and I read it, and I didn't notice who the signatories were. I just read the letter, and it seemed, in some ways it was sort of like to me, it was one of these, we hold these truths to be self-evident sort of things. Like it wasn't asking for a thing that hadn't previously been requested in this particular phase of whatever culture war we're currently in. It just seemed like this moment right now, as people are doing a totally other sort of reckoning with respect to the deep roots of racism in this country, that you would have these elite writers, public intellectuals, scholars, historians, asking for, pleading for a kind of rational thought, and a sort of, a place of discourse. They themselves are asking for a safe space in which to err, to risk the exploration of ideas. And it seems on its face perfectly legitimate to want these things. And I think there are so many layers of things happening with respect to the letter's arrival. And then you get to this question of the signatories. And I think that I think one of the things the letter is sort of arguing for is a real realization, or it's not arguing for this. It is noticing that we have gotten away from the ability to be discursive with each other in a reasonable or civilized way. And there's no middle ground, according to some people, for the actual give and take in what discourse requires. And, you know, people of being of different minds getting together to sort of think things through. Often in public, I mean, public discourse is something else that we, you know, like healthy public discourse is not a thing that we do in quite the same way that we once did. So now we have this sort of performance of a public discourse in a way which is much closer to what Jon was describing with respect to shame. And so the people who objected to the Harpers Letter, which, by the way, the letter itself, just to enumerate some of the things it was asking for, it was or observing and lamenting, you know, the curtailing of serious intellectual exploration, serious intellectual discourse in college campuses. It was lamenting the ability or the freedom to fuck up, basically, without, you know, an onslaught of public, somewhat anonymous, given how Twitter works, opprobrium. It was lamenting things that, you know, you could have, these were laments from 2015, 2016, 2018. They could probably be the laments of 2022, but their arrival in this summer, the summer of, you know, George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and earlier in the year, Ahmaud Arbery's death, these many deaths. And the reckoning with those deaths and the sort of structural reasons for the proliferation of these murders and many other forms of entrenched systemic racism. I think that there is a way to take umbrage at the letter and the people who signed it. Now, the last thing I'll say before we move on to Kim is, I think there was a way for people to see who signed the letter and to run the gist of the letter if the letter was actually even read. And with all due respect to some of the people who've been mad at the signatories, they seem to have read the letter. But it was more the going after individual signatories that was really fascinating, because if the letter had just been published with nobody having, like, with you not being able to see who signed it, yeah, I think it's a slightly different thing. But now it's like, these are like, some of these people have active, open scores to settle. Like if you're J.K. Rowling, having, you know, openly asserted this question about what a woman is, what a biological woman is, what a real woman is. There are other people on this list who you know, Twitter is essentially mad at still. And the idea that these names are on this list pleading for a form of free speech, and the exploration or the freedom to have a space for intellectual ideas was just too much for some people.
Yeah, it's like a new phenomenon of shaming by association. You know, it's
well, I mean, not by association.
Who else signed it? But,
I mean, they signed the letter. Like, if you sign the letter, you might not have known what you were in for, but you signed the letter, and the names on the letter are public, and therefore, you kind of have to be open to whatever is coming your way.
Yeah. No, I mean, fair enough. But I mean, obviously, I'm not trying to make a joke here, but if you signed a letter and 12 other signatures were convicted serial killers, you know, there's a certain presumption that might follow from that.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I think people aren't going, I think people are being very deliberate in the people they've chosen to go after the letter itself, right? I mean, at least as far as I can tell, like nobody's going after Wynton Marsalis for signing the letter, as far as I can tell.
That would be terrible.
You know, one thing I noticed is there were not a lot of Hollywood people who signed that letter. I don't know if you noticed that, Kim. Did you?
Well, I'm not a student of the letter. I mean, I know about the letter. I looked at the letter. I looked at the noise around the letter. I thought it was actually kind of like a sort of Barry Levinson movie or something, like Wag the Dog, except the letter, because it's kind of, I mean, to me, it was kind of funny that this very earnest letter is published. And I have to criticize the letter. I felt like if you really want to make a point and amplify your point, why are you cite these things that are bad, and there's not one link to help any interested person who's going to look at the letter, who may not be immersed in that elite world of the people who were asked to sign the letter, not Hollywood people, John, as you point out, because they're not necessarily part of the elite world that was asked to sign the letter. So, you know, let's say I'm in good faith, I want to know, but I'm not like immersed, and there's not one, it's lazy not to put links to something that would amplify your point. You know, I'm not to bog down the letter. So that was my first reaction is, you know, if you're going to do a letter, first of all, I agree. I had the why now, like why now? There's so much going on in the world. Our heads are all exploding, and let's talk about this now. I mean, there is public shaming going on. We see it on Twitter. We see, you know, somebody walks into a Costco and acts like a jerk. And I have to say, I have very mixed feelings, because on the one hand, I want to drag that guy too. On the other hand, to have the internet ride down on you is a pretty daunting, terrifying, irreversible disaster. But going back to the letter, I just felt like, how funny that you're asking for, you know, oh, please let us all be free to speak. Oh, wait, I'm not going to be in a letter with you. And yes, I think the J.K. Rowling thing is like, what? You know, you're signing a letter, but you have, the whole thing was like a bit of a comedy. I mean, I think the issue is serious, but the letter unfortunately turned out to be sort of a version of the Imagine song for intellectuals, of this earnestness that didn't land and became itself, you know, sort of like the dog chasing its tail.
John, you have any thoughts on this?
Oh, many, but most of which have already been expressed by Wesley and Kim. We're really not in disagreement here, and I'm sorry to say. They would say that the reason why now for the letter, because I agree with you, I think it's strange to be concentrating on this at this extraordinary moment of social change. I think what they would say, and in fact some of them did say to me today on Twitter when I was critical of the is that they believe that the sort of what they would call the authoritarianism of the left is as serious and important as the Trump presidency. And you know, and I think I mean, I've got a terrible sort of Godwin metaphor, which is it's a bit like, you know, Christopher Isherwood had written Goodbye to Berlin and made it all about the linguistic flaws of the anti-Nazis. It just feels like a sort of slightly odd thing to concentrate on, but I realise that's a completely overblown metaphor.
Don't apologize for that. I'm good with that.
Okay.
You could argue the same about this. You could argue the same about this panel. I mean, there are all these raging issues of social injustice,
but we're talking about
we're talking about, you know, sort of individuals.
That's very true. But the reason, as Kim says, one of the problems with the letter was that it didn't give any examples. It's just a very vague notion about free speech, about discourse. And of course, there's nothing in the letter that you could really disagree with. I mean, the letter is just very sensible, and everybody wants people to speak freely without fear of censure and so on. But I think the problem was, especially because there were no examples in the letter, you look at the signatories, and the fact is, you know, there's some people in that letter who I think are against public shaming, like I am, because of what happened to people like Justine Sacco, which felt like a disproportionate punishment, a miscarriage of justice, she couldn't defend herself, she was asleep on a plane, and so on. But J.K. Rowling, for as far as I know, the only reason why there's so much opprobrium towards her is because of her gender critical views, and that's just, whatever you feel about that issue, it's a completely different thing. She's an activist, and she's involved in a movement that doesn't want trans women to be able to self-ID. It's a very particular political issue, which is completely different from somebody being disproportionately punished for a misspeak. And so to conflate the two, as the letter kind of, you could argue, implicitly does, makes it just too much of a mess.
I mean, I wonder though if one of the things that the letter, I mean, I have two divergent feelings about the letter. The one of which is that I think it was very open. I don't know if the signatories felt this way, but I think the letter was very open to having the thing that is happening in response to it to happen, right? I think, you know, many people think it was presented into the public forum as an act of trolling, despite the sincerity and the earnestness with which it is pleading for these things that are perfectly reasonable to ask for in a lot of ways. But at the same time, I think that one of the things that is, under ordinary circumstances, if this letter had come out like last year at some point, I think it would have been fun to marvel at the spectrum of people on the letter, like who signed it. And there are people on that list that I know can't stand each other. And then there are people I know, I mean, just, you know, the idea that you have this letter that includes, great historians and J.K. Rowling, George Packer signed it, Glenn Lowry signed it, all like the range of people, Nell Urban Painter signed it. I mean, you just have this, range, Malcolm Gladwell, this range of people who are all unified in their belief in what can only be described as a kind of response to what is being perceived as a lack of free speech. The other context for the response to the letter, within what I was talking about before, is that this has basically been a moment of petitions, right? These are like public petitions on behalf of elite people arguing or insisting that systems re-examine themselves in some way. The first prominent one, I believe, was the BIPOC letter, the BIPOC letter that was addressed to the white theater on behalf of non-white people who were involved in the theater world, particularly in New York City. And then the letter after that was a not dissimilar letter, but aimed more broadly with respect to representation in American entertainment that, many other prominent artists and creative people signed. And so to have this letter that is doing a slightly different thing than the tone of the other letters, which was, the other two letters were speaking to the moment of a kind of structural reform. And this letter is kind of like slipping into the back door or something. It's more aggressive than a slip into the back door, but it is advocating for the people who are doing the advocacy, like toppling the statues, getting the course curriculums adjusted, misuse, like, I don't know. I mean, nobody's misusing defund the police. Defund is a broad and generous term. But it seems to be a reaction against what some of those people who've signed the letter and subsequently explained their relationship to it is as a kind of a separate reactionary moment in which cancellation has become the dominant mode of discourse, which basically means there is no discourse, there is just cleansing and cancellation, which, you know, I don't think any serious person would agree is healthy.
I feel like all these prominent people who are supposedly canceled are not shutting up at all. I mean, they're still making so much noise. Like, please be canceled, some of them.
Well, wait, Kim, who do you mean?
I don't know. I mean, I mean, it's an out of date reference to say Milo, whatever the heck his name.
Oh, Yiannopoulos, yeah.
But that kind of guy, you know, they never shut up. You were going to say something, John.
I want to, I mean, I want to say one or two things on behalf of the letter. Not that I feel, well, firstly, Margaret Atwood is a signatory and she's a great advocate of trans rights. So there's certainly not an orthodoxy in the letter writers.
Right.
But the signatories started quarreling amongst themselves, which was the comedy part to me.
Yeah, yes. And second, you know, the kind of criticism they can receive can be really brutal. I mean, Katie Herzog, who's a young writer on an alt weekly called The Stranger, who wrote a piece about detransitioners, ended up with fly posters all over Seattle saying Katie Herzog is a transphobe.
That's terrible.
Yeah, no, I really disagree with her views on trans rights. I'm on the opposite side of the argument, but that's terrible. And of course, one thing that can happen when that happens to you is you double down. You enter the intellectual dark web, and that's your identity now. In a sense, actually, one thing, I wrote a book about psychopaths once, and one thing I've noticed as a weird consequence of the overuse of public shaming as a weapon is that shamed people, a little bit like hospital superbugs, mutating to so they can't be treated, kind of become shameless. They refuse to apologize, they double down, they can become caricatures of themselves, and all of those things are, it's like, you know, what sort of person refuses to feel remorse, refuses to apologize? It's a psychopath. So as if we're teaching shamed people to act more like psychopaths. But the reason why I don't go too far in that argument is because they're public figures, they're agents provocateurs, and that's a very different thing. That's the, you know, it can get extreme and it can get brutal, but ultimately it's the rough and tumble.
I was definitely talking about public figures. I'm not some person. And I would just want to say that we're in this moment that is so fraught right now, where there's going to be a bit of overdoing things, you know. I mean, there's going to be a bit of overheated rhetoric, but I think it's in the service of changes that need to happen. And there's going to be unfortunate overreactions, and of course, if it's on the left, the right will immediately seize on every instance where the left looks crazy or overdone. But it's a messy situation to change things, and that's what we're hopefully at a place where things are going to change.
I mean, I think we're talking a little bit about that collateral damage of the messiness of this period of change. I'd like to get to what at least I see as the crux of this conversation. I'm going to invoke my law school education a little bit, if you don't mind. We learned in law school that the purposes of punishment, there are 4 of them. Rehabilitation, retribution, so that the people who are wrong can feel like that the person who wronged them is punished. Deterrence, so that other people don't do what the person who is punished did. And incapacitation, so that if someone's in prison, they can't go out and kill more people. So I keep in mind those ideas, I guess I would just say, in this conversation. And so what I would say is that over the last millennia, systems have evolved with laws, with processes for invoking those laws and judging people, and for punishment. There has evolved, as we all know, very recently, a parallel system of judgment and punishment that uses the internet as an accelerant. And it doesn't take advantage of those things. When you go to prison, you're presumably a ward of the state, and they're responsible to rehabilitate you. When we're talking here about cancel culture or the equivalent, there's really no process out there to rehabilitate, to reconsider, and maybe that's just a byproduct of technology and what we've done. But I guess the question I have for the group is, should there be? Is it possible to have a system where people who have been canceled or have wronged, if it isn't violating the law, is it possible to have a system to rehabilitate them? Or is this just going to be an anarchic system and we're just fated to live with an anarchic system?
Well, there's no system.
Could there be?
Is
that the inevitable thing?
Right. What you're describing is a certain, there is a degree of anarchy to the way this proceeds, but it's not anarchy without cause, though. Let's be clear. It isn't. I think that what we're talking about is extrajudicial, right? Obviously, but I think that I'm curious about how you guys feel about this. I actually think that I understand where this energy has come from. I know it originates before 2016, but I think it really doesn't. And John can correct me if I'm wrong as a historian on such matters, but it feels to me like a lot of the energy around not simply cancellation, but about with respect to, just to stay in the realm of art and culture, there is a kind of intolerance for any sort of harms being done. And if you have access to the alleged harmers, it's much easier to descend upon them and not so much correct the behavior, but to practice a sort of shaming through cancellation, right? I think that energy comes from a real place. And some of that real place is feeling like you have no power after 2016 to, if you were a person who, for instance, does not support, the current president, there's no real outlet after you're having voted. And if you're paying attention to the popular count versus the electoral count, if you believe that that 3 million vote discrepancy is wrong, I think there's a way, just in the ethos of the way that we conduct ourselves in these forums, there's something really satisfying about being able to make things you don't like go away. Whether or not it's right or wrong, you have the power to do it. You can amass a group of people to go after, whether it's Louis C.K. or S.H.I.T. I can't remember. Her name will come to me. Anyway, there's a whole list of people who, and there are gradations among all of the affronts, but they wind up being treated more or less the same. Alison Roman is who I was thinking. And there's really no difference. I think the question to your question, John, about what does rehabilitation or redemption, if we're going to use that concept, I like rehab. Redemption might be too holy for me. But there is a means by which you can start to do that. I think if we're talking about Alison Roman, she can go on Z-Way's Instagram live show and allow herself to be made fun of for that interview that she gave. I think if you're Louis C.K., you have the opportunity to continue to practice your stand-up. And I think there is an expectation among some people, and he has no obligation to follow this. But I mean, there is a way that some people who go to these shows, and I've seen him perform now 3 times, and there is a little part of me that is curious to see how whether this is going to make his way into his act, or whether it's going to do what Jon is talking about in some ways, which is to make him more shameless with respect to what he knows people want and he won't give them.
I mean, I'm often asked this as a Time's Up reporter. So I feel like you're asking me, Jon, in a way, because I am the Time's Up reporter who has ended careers. And I think that it depends on there's a continuum of conduct. And if the conduct is Harvey Weinstein, you go to jail. If the conduct is something quite different, I'm trying to think of a good example. I mean, Aziz Ansari wasn't even conduct. That was nothing. That was a bad fake excuse for journalism. But in between, there's degrees of misconduct. What I haven't seen yet, and I'm saying this just as Matt Weiner got a deal at FX to do a series after he had been accused, I haven't seen anybody say, I have gotten the message. I have gone out into the woods with my drum and figured out what a terrible person I am. And they try to slither back again and again. I hear about the attempts of somebody trying to get this job or that. And I feel like, why is it so damn hard, to just say, and disappear for a while, go away and look at and do a searching inventory of how you did this and come out with then we can say, okay, let's see your new behavior. But I mean, Peter Linkoff, a showrunner on big CBS shows who was just fired yesterday, he said, I'm now listening. Okay.
My favorite expression in this moment, by the way.
Have you heard Dan Harmon's apology yet? I listened to it yesterday.
Dan Harmon, yes.
I think he did do one. I haven't heard it, but I heard he did do one. And
it's it was real, and it was sincere and almost forensic in its in the depth of its sort of its chagrin and remorse.
Right, but doesn't the forensic quality of it make you question sincerity in it?
No, I don't. He knew it. I mean, I don't question that apology. It seems sincere to me. I mean, I feel like he did it. He acknowledged the behavior. I mean, an apology to me, I mean, let's just focus on like what a good apology is, right? I think that what Dan Harmon did was acknowledge the harm, acknowledge the person to whom he did these things, and then he spent time sort of thinking about what it was that he actually did do, which is basically he repeated what he was accused of having done in his apology. I mean, I don't know. Well, Jon, what would that look like to you?
Well, that does sound like a good apology, and I wish I'd read it, but I haven't.
It was it was spoken. It was whatever. You can find it. I can send it.
You can find it. I'll send it to you.
Cool. I do think in a way it's slightly our fault in that we're forensically reading apologies to figure out whether they're sincere or not, which obviously puts them in a difficult place because they are so self-conscious knowing.
Well, I'll say there are so few who have even made the attempt that I would agree with you, except please give me an attempt to be forensic with.
I think that's, I'm trying to think of somebody who's really genuinely, sincerely, well, it sounds like Dan Harmon's done it, it's like genuinely.
Alone in the crowd.
Yeah. But what is interesting, I think as well, is the fact that, there's a judge called Judge Ted Poe. He's a congressman, and he was famous. He was famous for public punishments. I interviewed him, and I interviewed one of the people who he punished. He killed 2 people while driving drunk, and instead of going to jail, he had to hold a sign outside bars, and this was in Texas, saying, "I killed 2 people while driving drunk. Don't do it or you end up like me." And he told me that he was, obviously terrified, but he said it really worked for him, and it made it okay. And the reason why it worked for him was because people were stopping their cars and saying, "Oh, you poor thing, come to church with me," and so on. And he said it was the empathy, which is what put him on the path to salvation. So I do feel, and this is, I'm talking about something different to the letter here, which I feel is a different category, but I think in general, and I'm also not talking about people who've done terrible things, people who've committed crimes with their victims and they should go to jail. I think if we try and empathize with them, it might work.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question. I think I know the answer, and I'm asking it of you, Kim. But so, in a situation where there are behavioral norms in an industry, and that somebody acts within those behavioral norms, which then those norms change, and someone is called out for behavior that was within those norms, but now is found reprehensible. Is there an argument for someone to be grandfathered in I mean, obviously there's a full range of behavior I'm talking about, but is there an argument for someone who says, at the time, that's the way people were acting. I now understand things are different. I will change my behavior. I do not want to be judged by what I did before, and I don't think I should be judged by what I did before. Is there some support for that?
I think the last part of what you just said is where the problem is. Abuse is abuse. If Hollywood tolerated abuse, shame on Hollywood. But if you are an abuser, you don't get to say, I'm not going to apologize because those were the standards of the time. If you recognize that you did wrong, own that you did wrong, and say that you are sorry and you're not going to do it again, and show some activism. I'm thinking out loud, but I think about how Ryan Murphy, portrayed trans characters in Tuck, which was terrible, but accepted, and everybody thought, oh, that's such a clever show. Then he moved forward and he did Pose, which was a genuinely groundbreaking show for trans characters. And I think that as somebody who might have criticisms of Ryan Murphy, I can accept and recognize that change. I almost see Pose as an amend, and I see things differently now. So yes, but I think we're also going to see some people who are going to get, basically Hollywood people, they're going to get canceled because they're from a certain, it may be an era, and that is their MO, and they don't seem to have 2 speeds. And the industry is going to drop these people. I think Peter Lenkov is the first. He can say he's listening. We'll see whether he can reconstruct himself. But you've really got to work. The apology is not some simple thing. We just saw, was it Ryan Adams apologize? Who was the?
No.
Yeah,
Ryan Adams. That's right.
And then he didn't apologize.
It wasn't. Yeah. I mean,
who called him out? I'm trying to remember that.
Mandy Moore.
Thank you.
Moore's ex-wife.
Like, dude, if you're going to really apologize, why don't you go and get your ducks in a row before you go public and try to seek your redemption? This is The Art of Apology is a book that Jon Ronson could write.
It's been written.
Well, maybe people need to read it.
Well, I would say, John Sloss, I feel like I always find that defense to be inadequate because it's the defense, it's a very American defense. It is a defense that goes back to the founding of this country, and it goes back to 1865. It goes back, it was unacceptable, during the Reconstruction for former enslavers to I mean, very few of them realize the error of their ways, so to speak. But it wouldn't have mattered because the damage had already been done. And so there's something about, I mean, these things have to happen on a curve. And for you to ask that question would require a case. And there's no absolute, there's no context that can really ameliorate the damage depending on what the case is that's been done to people. And I think part of what is happening in this moment right now is, and one of the reasons that's allowed America to remain the country that it is that it could always, I mean, we are always recontextualizing things to escape the reckoning that is long overdue. And I think if you keep moving the line for what's acceptable and people can keep up with the moving of the line, nobody's ever gonna have to apologize for anything. And I think
okay, I'm not trying to make an argument here, but under the law, if you do something that is then deemed illegal, you can't be prosecuted for what you did before it was deemed illegal.
I think everybody knows that treating people like garbage or enslaving them, or whatever version, isn't, I mean, that has to be, you can't self-justify because it was accepted in an industry where power was concentrated in the hands of a few people. And if you had a certain kind of talent, you could behave a certain kind of way.
Fair enough.
Yeah, people didn't just become people like in 2020. That is, I mean, I'm not saying this to you, John Sloss. I'm just saying, like, I find that some of the excuses that have been given since 2017 to now for behavior that, women didn't just become like equal human beings because, the New Yorker and the New York Times exposed some bad behavior, right? And I did find, I mean, I just don't have a lot of patience for that. Like, okay, fine, you've given me a context for your behavior. Now what are you gonna do? Where do you go from here? Like, what are your allyships? What rehab are you doing? What work are you gonna do going forward? I mean, I think your burden for demonstrating an awareness that you did something wrong is high, depending on what you're accused of having done.
I think I'm sorry, but is a bad formula. Just
Yep.
don't go to the, leave but out. I'm sorry.
Yes. Classic, how not to give an apology 101.
Yeah. And actually, we're all making it sound like all past transgressions at times when it wasn't considered transgressions are sort of capital offences now. And it's actually not true. It's sometimes true, but I can think of a number of occasions where there's British comedians who wore blackface in the 90s and have made fulsome apologies.
I 100% forgive Jimmy Kimmel for anything he ever did wrong.
Just on principle, or?
No, he's done good. He was great on gun violence. He was great on trying to save Trump, the health, the ACA, he used his forum. And when he was doing the Man Show or whatever garbage he did earlier on, I'm sure he knows he's an idiot. Joe Biden, we're going to all have to say, okay, you supported some bad legislation, but guess what? I'm voting for you. And I'm asking everybody I know in the world to vote for you. That's just how it's going to be. I do believe that Joe Biden is able to understand to some degree. I
was about to say, Kim, don't get carried away.
I'm not getting carried away. To some degree, Joe Biden went through some life things and he worked with Obama. And I think I think it's possible to learn, and I'm not going to litigate something that happened, years ago, especially if people are doing the right thing now.
Yeah.
That's the important thing, though, is having shown some capacity for not only contrition, but advancement beyond the thing for which you claim to be contrite.
Understanding that the world has changed, the old way of doing things was worse than the new way of doing things. You got caught up in a bubble, and now you realize that there's a better way of doing things. I think in those kinds of contexts, people do carry on with their careers. You know, things aren't quite that Stalinist.
All right. Okay, I'm going to shift a little bit to talk about the work. Wesley, you wrote an article last year after watching Leaving Neverland about Michael Jackson.
Mm-hmm.
And from what I can tell, by not long after that extended movie was shown, Michael Jackson's music was as popular as it had ever been. The question is, what is the meaning of that? Is it the art separate from the person? Is it a matter of the quality of the art? Is it, what do we take?
I mean, I think in Michael Jackson's case, it was, I mean, Michael Jackson is a unique case in terms of his place in the culture. I think that a lot of the way that we talk about Michael Jackson, the way we've always talked about Michael Jackson as a object and bearer of trauma, has been with a kind of empathy, right? I mean, I think that most people, and this might not be generationally the case, but I mean, I think there are a lot of people who are aware of the Jackson family story. And there are a lot of people who have a like vague understanding of the sort of unnatural thing that fame and celebrity are, to know that Michael Jackson had a strange childhood. And I grew up as a kid being told that Michael Jackson didn't have a regular childhood, which was meant to account for how his behavior operated. And so there are any number of extenuating circumstances to place onto this person being fully aware at the same time of the things that he's accused of having done to young boys. And I just think that in his case, I mean, there is a defiance on some people's part to just like, you know, say, I don't care, I don't believe the accusations, and he's Michael Jackson, I love him no matter what. It's a not insignificant number of people. But then there's also the ability to just know that this is a person who did terrible things, and to keep that in mind if you have the capacity to do so while listening to his music. I mean, there are lots of people who I would just identify as who I know or you know, so-called cancelers, who also love Michael Jackson. I think, you know, I don't know that I would describe that as a contradiction. I would describe that as people having a capacity to hold several things in their beings at the same time, to be, you know, aware of simultaneous things at the same time. I mean, it's you know, I mean, but again, I'm a case-by-case person. There are no absolutes for these things. So you have to give me an example for me to adjudicate whether or not I understand, or whether, you know, it's okay to still have a relationship to that person's work.
Aren't there a bunch of really hardcore Michael Jackson fans who actually refuse to believe the allegations? And
oh yeah.
So that's not, so in a way that's like cognitive dissonance. That's the inability to hold for those people.
Oh, it's the refusal to, right? Yes.
Yeah, but then other people, yeah.
I mean, I was uncomfortable with Michael Jackson before, and after watching Leaving Neverland, I just can't do it. But I understand that it's a complex issue around Michael Jackson, because for some people, he represents something, you know, something that is so immensely important to them. And I don't just mean that they like his music. I mean, as a Black man, sort of, I mean, he was confused, but
I mean, he wasn't confused about his being Black, though.
he seemed to be, I don't know how I can't, I don't even want to
His
get into that.
blackness was not in dispute, but like I hear what you're saying. I hear what you're saying.
You're not, I'm,
Yeah.
excuse my clumsy way of saying what I'm saying. He had ambivalent feelings about how he looked, obviously, but he's a black man and he got to a certain place. It's similar to OJ. There are people who feel that a black man who achieves success, R. Kelly, whatever, will be dragged down. And when something like this happens, it's proof. And it's unfortunate because Michael Jackson, in my opinion, committed terrible, terrible crimes. Having said that, I like 19th century literature. I read Trollope and I have to filter out all of his disgusting anti-Semitism. And I kind of do, I don't like it, but to me, that is like long ago bigotry. It's not the same as seducing and raping little boys, which I cannot get that out of. Once I watch, especially once I saw their accounts, I can't get that out of my head. I mean, it's just not possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think from again, like the individual basis for some of these things. I mean, all of these people, like they're none of it's settled. I mean, whether we're talking about Polanski or Woody Allen or R. Kelly, I mean, these aren't
what you believe. I think it's clear Roman Polanski raped a child and probably more than one. I'm not okay with it. It's very hard when somebody has an artistic talent. But I thought we agreed, and obviously I was wrong, that child rape is bad. It turns out we see institutions like the Catholic Church who were willing to coexist with it. We see all kinds of examples where, the Boy Scouts, where apparently people were going to look the other way. I thought that was like one of the greatest crimes in the world that you could commit, but we are seeing that wasn't necessarily so. But for me, that is a line where I can't say I'm going to forgive the artist for Roman Polanski or Michael Jackson.
You feel that Polanski's movies should be erased from culture?
No, I don't.
No.
I don't think that should. And the Gone with the Wind, I don't think it should be. It wasn't withdrawn. It was withdrawn for 5 seconds to give it some context. And I think context is a good thing. I don't know how you handle it, the court case of a Polanski or Woody Allen. I just think that people should hopefully be aware of what, that there are crimes and those crimes should be not just covered up because, oh, I like Annie Hall.
Well, sadly, we have reached the end of our allotted time.
So sad. What about our questions?
Well, I hogged it all, and I apologize for that. We'll have to do a redo, but that's my province as the moderator. So I was greedy with you all, and I apologize to the audience. And I want to thank you all. This has been, hopefully this is a conversation that will continue and can be had with incrementally less, anxiety about how we address these issues. And I just want to thank everyone at Synetic for helping me prepare for this. I took it very seriously and tried to do my homework. But not too seriously, because I'm going to leave you with one thought, and that is, and I think it's oddly appropriate to this topic, and that is, build a man a fire and he'll be warm for a day. Set a man on fire and he'll be warm for the rest of his life.
I've set some men on fire, John. I don't feel bad.
You may have think I directed that at you, but not necessarily. Anyway, thank you. Thank all three of you. And onward.
Thanks, everybody.
Great to see you all.
Bye-bye.
Good night.